Thank you. Thank you, Dale. All the work that I have in this show is based on the work of Sun Tzu that was written 2,500 years ago. Starting with the first quote in his book, where he says, "This is war. It is the most important skill in the nation. It is the basis of life and death. It is a philosophy of survival and destruction. You must know it well." When Sun Tzu talks about war, what he's talking about is not the idea of fighting. What he's talking about is the idea of strategy. Basically, 2,500 years ago, Sun Tzu invented the science of strategy, and it's amazing how little strategy has changed in all those years. For these 2,500 years, the knowledge of how strategy works and why it works has been around, but very few people know what strategy is and how it's worked. For most of this time, the use of strategy has been limited to the military area. About a few decades ago, say 30, 40 years ago, the ideas of strategy started to be used in large corporations, and there were several people that were sort of instrumental with that. The Boston Consulting Group, there was a man named Bruce Henderson that brought strategy over. Colonel Boyd, who's actually a Marine pilot, started working in the business area and so on. And the ideas of strategy started finding their application in business. And interestingly enough, those same 2,500-year-old principles that had worked all those years in war were being used virtually unchanged in the business world. Today, of course, we write books about strategy, and we apply these same principles not only to running your own business, but to building a career, to parenting teens, to finding romance, and so on. The same ideas work all the time. In today's presentation, we're basically breaking the discussion of strategy into three separate parts. In the first section, we'll be talking about how you analyze strategic positions. Frequently when I give seminars, I just talk about this first section because it's really the key to strategy, is understanding what your unique strategic position in the world is. In the second hour, hour and a half, what we'll be talking about is opportunities to advance your position, what progress means, and how you identify, how you open yourself up to the opportunities that are around you. And in the third part, we'll talk about how you succeed in advancing your position. To start with the first section, analysis of a strategic position, tell you a little bit about myself and how I got to the front of this room. If we go back about 30 years, I was an aimless college dropout. I'd had about 4 different jobs. I've been fired from a couple of them. I was theoretically a bright guy, but I wasn't very successful. And my sister gave me my first copy of The Art of War. And I happened to be in sales at the time. And my family was from a military background, and I read the book thinking about that I was learning about war, but being in sales and sort of struggling in sales, I saw how the ideas in Sun Tzu's book really applied to the kind of challenges I was meeting every day. I was able to make the connection between military war and the kind of battles I was facing every day as a salesperson. After I started studying Sun Tzu, my life started changing pretty dramatically. I started getting promoted about every 8 months with larger and larger companies. Within 7 years, had my own software company. And one of the first things I did after we started growing and having a sales force was I said, I've got to teach my sales guys how I think about strategy and how I see strategic situations. So I did my first adaptation of Sun Tzu's The Art of War because most people couldn't make the connection between business and war. I did my first adaptation called The Art of Sales, and we were very successful. We became one of the Inc. 500 fastest growing companies in America. Our software company they started writing articles about our use of Sun Tzu's philosophy in magazines like PC Week. And they started inviting me to speak about Sun Tzu and Sun Tzu's principles. And initially, actually, I'd started doing seminars like this really with the intention of promoting my software company. I never really saw a career in teaching strategy, but I understood a lot about it. And of course, as people started asking me to train them on strategy, I had to learn more and more about it. When I sold my software company in 1997, people were still inviting me literally all over the world. Our customers in the software company were companies like AT&T and Motorola and GE and people like that. So I started with really kind of large, well-known companies, and then I started getting invited around the world to talk about Sun Tzu's philosophy. And the companies started saying, well, couldn't you apply these same principles to management? I'd done a book on sales, but I said, okay, with a company like Kraft, I'll do a book on management for you. And they said, well, can't you apply these to marketing? I said, yes, same principles can be applied to marketing. And before I knew it, I had a whole line of books. And I was actually not selling them in the bookstores at that time. I didn't know anything about the book market. But we brought them out in the book market, and the book started winning awards. And that's sort of gone on from there. Last year, our sales were up about 240% in books. So the same principles that I used to build my software company, I'm now using to build a publishing company, and they work very consistently. Today, my reputation is as a strategist. I appear literally on hundreds of radio talk shows talking about the latest breaking news. Of course, everybody talks about strategy, but actually most of the people you hear on the radio and television literally know nothing about what strategy is, how it works, or anything. And what I can do for these radio shows is put things into a real strategic perspective, that is, analyze strategic positions and talk about how people can potentially advance those positions. The science of strategy, they all started with Sun Tzu. And Sun Tzu, as I said, lived about 2,500 years ago. He lived in what was called the autumn and spring period of ancient China. This was before China was an empire. It was a bunch of warring kingdoms, very much like ancient Greece. You hear about the ancient battles between Sparta and Athens and Thebes, and China was very much the same kind of area. There were 500 cities. All these cities were fighting each other. And during this period, Sun Tzu was part of the landless nobility. He was a nobleman that had lost their kingdom because of this constant strife. And he was hired, actually, by one of the kingdoms called the Kingdom of Wu, which was a little tiny kingdom sort of in the corner. It was considered semi-barbaric. It was on the wrong side of the Yangtze River. And you know what it's like on the wrong side of the Yangtze River. It's just not that nice. But they hired Sun Tzu. And during Sun Tzu's lifetime, he actually turned Wu into the first empire of China. He conquered all of the Yangtze Valley. Unfortunately, he did die after about 60 years. And Wu fell back into obscurity. But his work was kept alive by his descendant, whose name was Sun Ping. And Sun Ping brought it to the king of Qin. And the king of Qin, of course, used these ideas to conquer the entire region, which we now know as China. And that's how China got to be well known. Now, Sun Tzu's principles were passed down from, through Chinese nobility, but they were kept very secret. Literally, I talk to a lot of large groups today, and frequently a lot of Oriental people in the audience, and they'll come up to me after the seminar and say, that their parents didn't want them to come because these are secret things that you're not supposed to talk about, and the people back in China will hunt you down and kill you if you find out about Sun Tzu's strategy because it's not meant for the common people. And so literally for thousands of years, this information was protected. It didn't come west until the 1800s. The first translation was done in French by a French Jesuit missionary. It fell into the hands of a young French corporal. Actually, he was an Italian. He became fairly successful and conquered all of Europe. His name was Napoleon. The only book he carried with him was a book called The Art of War. Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, is fairly well known. However, it doesn't translate well into English. It's written in what some people describe as poetic equations, what I describe really as mathematical equations. It really defies in many ways translation. It's like translating Euclid's geometry into sentences and paragraphs. It's just very confusing and not very interesting. The ideas are very powerful. And what I'll be talking about today are the ideas in that book, not necessarily Sun Tzu's equations and how they work.